Welcome to Living Fully. Each episode is a chance to talk about mental health in a way that's simple, honest, and helpful. We'll share stories, tips, and tools to help you feel supported and feel your best. I'm your host, Catherine Hertig. One of the best ways to get the most out of counseling is having a goal or sense of direction, whether it's something you want to change or a way you want to feel. In today's episode, I chat with social worker Carmen Sadoway about why setting goals matter, how to figure out what goals might work for you, and what to do if you're feeling stuck and don't know where to start. A big part of counseling and, to get the most out of it is actually setting goals. And that's what we're chatting about today. I'm here with Carmen Sadoway. Thanks so much for chatting with me. Did I get that?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. I like this topic a lot, so happy to talk about it with you.
Excellent. So you haven't been on the podcast before, so welcome. Tell us a bit about yourself.
So I'm a staff counselor at Calgary Counselling Centre, and I have a master's in social work from Carleton University. I've been in the field since 2012, so been around for a little while now. I've been worked in different kinds of settings and organizations, seen all different kinds of issues come up in counseling and all different kinds of goals in my career. So, yeah.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm excited to chat with you today. Yeah, so, let's start right from the beginning. Why is goal setting such an important part of the counseling process?
So goals really help us focus the work. They end up being a kind of a compass for counseling conversations to come back to, and it's something that we can kind of always just keep checking in on. How are we doing? Is what we're working on in counseling hitting the mark for what is important to you and what changes you want to be seeing in your life? And when we're clear on goals, we're clear on direction of what we're doing in counseling. We know where we're going and also why we're doing what we're doing and why we want to get where we're going.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, how does having a clear goal or kind of destination, how does that help clients see progress?
Mm-hmm. So when we try to make them really concrete and tangible, like real things that you'd like to see yourself doing in your life or real changes that you want to see yourself making, it just really helps us stay focused, not just on feeling better right away, but doing or living better in some way.
Right.
And when it's framed as an action, it's also something that we can observe and measure and evaluate. And then we can see how sometimes by little actions in service of the goal, we can move in that direction of where we want to go. And then we can also look back and also see how far we've come.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure it's not uncommon. I mean, I can speak from experience with counseling where I've gone in and I get that question from a counselor, like, what's your goal? What do you want to get out of this? And I don't really have a clear answer. Like, I know I want to feel different, feel better, feel less anxious, less depressed, all that. Mm-hmm. But a goal, like, I don't really have that in my head. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, can counseling still be effective if someone isn't sure where to start?
Yeah, it can be sort of intimidating and like kind of some pressure, like, what's your goal? What are you working on? And it's actually really common that people come into counseling not initially knowing what their goals are, and that's totally okay. Sometimes people come to counseling because they're just going through something really, really stressful that they didn't anticipate, and it's impacting them in a big way.
Yeah.
And they just come in initially needing to talk it through, process it, vent about it, tell the story of it. And I do think that's really important and meaningful.
So that venting process, that is helpful?
It can be part of the process, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to find out what's going on in somebody's life and the impact that it's having on them to really understand where they are in the moment and how that might inform where they want to go. So that is important. But also, I think, sometimes when people are going through hard times, people's priorities and values can sometimes get really clear and crystallized. Like sometimes we talk to people who are have gone through a loss, if you've ever like lost someone that you've loved, and when we're thinking about the impact of that person on our life, sometimes our values and priorities become really clear. We're really clear on what's important to us. And sometimes when that happens, the goals for things to do differently in our own life can naturally follow. So sometimes we just kind of need to understand and take stock of what's happening before we kind of land on a direction.
So, like, as a counselor, do you often help clients kind of not create a goal, but help them figure out what their goal could be?
That's a big part of what we do, for sure, because it is so common that people don't come in thinking in those terms necessarily. Of, I'm only going to go into counseling if I have a goal. So that is part of what we're good at. But also just everyone comes into counseling for so many different reasons.
That's so true.
Yeah. Some people come in, they've got a clear idea of something that they want to change in their life, and they're just ready to like get to work on it. Other folks arrive with just sort of like an unclear sense of something's not sitting well with them in their life. That's really common and normal too. And some people come in because they're coping with some kind of challenging symptom of stress or a mental health issue, and they want some ideas on how to cope better. But I think a message that I just want to say to everybody is whatever brings people in, we meet you where you're at, and we work together as a team, and we collaborate to figure out together what's going to be useful for us to talk about or focus on together.
Yeah, that's a great point to make, because it's, it could be so many things that bring someone in. And the idea of setting a goal around that, it might not always be super obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it often isn't at first.
Yeah.
So we do take a little bit of time figuring out, where things are and where you want to go. Like I said, figuring out that direction. It's sometimes people arrive feeling a bit lost in some way. And so our goal as counselors is to kind of help facilitate a process so that together we can kind of line up on a direction that's going to feel good for you in your life.
How do you establish that balance between kind of focusing on a goal and working towards that, and simply kind of, like we said, venting or exploring emotions and talking things through? Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And I thought a lot about this question when you had sent it to me ahead of time. And, I really think that there's a place in therapy for tending to the relationship we have with ourselves, understanding our emotions, and really tending to our inner life, as I might put it.
Okay.
Because some folks have been bereft of that for various reasons in their life. And so learning to identify our emotional experiences and learn to notice and name our experience, it really can be tremendously important and empowering to people. And I actually think it can be really foundational for personal change. When we don't know who we are or what we're feeling, it's hard to know where we're going. So I do think that's an important part of the counseling journey, is spending time with your own experience, telling the story of it, making sense of it, and really kind of doing that inward look.
Yeah.
But I do think that we also live in the world. We interact with our environment. We're social creatures. We thrive when we're connected and doing things with purpose and care. And personally, I just think good therapy strikes a balance between helping people tend to their inner life as well as their outer life. So good goals, I think, should reflect both our inner values and our personal experience, but also touch on who we want to be in the world, how we want to show up, what difference we want to make, what legacy we want to have in our life. And I think we feel our most authentic when we're acting on goals that are really meaningful to us in a deep and personal way.
Yeah. Because one person's goal could be vastly different from someone else's.
Yeah, they usually are. For sure. But we need to, in addition to like really knowing ourselves in that way, but connecting it with ways that we connect to others and being in the world. And so I think therapy often is this simultaneous process of tending to our inner life and connecting us to the life we want to live out there in the world.
Right.
So it's kind of both. Yeah.
And then as we've been talking about this, kind of visualized it. I mean, when I hear goals, I just kind of think like setting the destination and then, planning out the trip step by step. But it's not always like that. Hey, like it's not linear. And sometimes you're going to have to go back and revisit things. And yeah.
Yeah. It's true. And I think sometimes sometimes we can think about it like a destination and we'll say like want to look at what we want the end of the journey to look like. And sometimes that can be a good place to start. But I think more often I think about it less of a destination and more of a direction. So,
okay.
There's lots of things that we're always working on that maybe we never fully arrive, but we might commit to a valued direction because it feels right in terms of the way that we want to show up. It feels congruent for who we are as people.
Yeah.
So I sometimes, I like that kind of valued direction as opposed to like crossing the finish line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of examples of goals that clients might have when they come in?
Yeah. So there's lots. There's an infinite variety, and they're as diverse as all the people that we get to work with.
Yeah.
And we always just want to make it like tailor it to each individual. Each person is unique. Every person's life story is unique. So it has to be personal and specific and meaningful to each person, each individual.
For sure.
And I think also it's in general good to think about setting goals, less around what we don't want, but rather what we want.
Yeah.
Because you were saying like, I don't want to, of course no one wants to feel anxious or stressed or anything, but then it's like, okay, let's reframe it into what you do want. So
totally. I remember, in early days of my counseling, it was exactly that. Like, I don't want to feel this sad anymore, but I don't know what that looks like. Yeah.
Right. So some examples, asked for some short-term goal examples. So someone, for instance, might say they want to learn how to communicate better with their spouse or with loved ones. Maybe they want to work on making an important decision about a job or making a lifestyle change. Maybe they want to better manage anxiety so that they can better enjoy the time with their kids.
Yeah.
Or maybe they want to learn how to cope better with ADHD, so they're more focused at school. So those are just a few of like kind of short term, but they're usually in the service of something larger, right? Like something meaningful that's a part of the big picture of their life.
For sure.
Yeah.
And kind of on that, like, are there specific goals that are better for certain challenges? Like if someone's dealing with anxiety, are they going to set kind of different goals than if they're dealing with trauma?
So it is always just so individual and unique to each person.
Yeah.
But based on my experience working with people and identifying certain goals that are kind of a match for a certain challenge, like sometimes there can be sort of some general themes that I consider.
Okay.
So for instance, for those of us who experience anxiety, we often we cope by trying to avoid negative feelings in some way. So it could be like we're declining a social invitation, or we're over preparing for an exam. These are all kinds of avoidance kinds of coping. And so a general goal or theme might be, instead of helping people avoid more, we want to help people approach what's being avoided.
Okay.
So I think about that with anxiety. For depression, sometimes when we're feeling depressed, we tend to cope with things that sometimes give us short-term relief, but they end up sort of de-energizing us.
Right.
So for that one, sometimes we need to look for things that re-energize us instead and kind of give us a sense of aliveness. I'll just give one more example. Sometimes when we're working with addiction, people sometimes talk about addiction as a disease of disconnection. So a theme might be that, like, as an antidote, as a goal of connection, as opposed to disconnection. So there's sometimes there's these general themes that I think about, but whatever it is, whatever a goal often involves. Sometimes some kind of rebalancing or recalibrating so that we can get back to functioning well and just having
recalibrating.
Yeah. And just kind of getting back to the life that you want in terms of like good quality of life.
Yeah. And I guess, it's kind of difficult to talk about it so generally when it is such an individual thing. It's not like we can say this is the goal you should set if you are having trouble in your relationship. And this is So
it's always very specific to the situation or the person, and their context.
So you talked about how the process of counseling is really collaborative. So, and I mean, that might be a surprise for some people to hear. Like, I think it's not uncommon for someone to think like, I'm going to go into counseling, I'm going to tell this person my problems and they're going to tell me how to fix it. So what is it actually like? What's that collaborative process?
So counselors they're really good at asking people questions. So our job isn't to necessarily give advice or lay it all out for like, okay, here's step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We do that together as a team.
Yeah.
But, first of all, with asking people questions, we really help people consider just various factors and just ask questions to help people get concrete and focused on their goal. I really do see it as a team effort. Like we help kind of explore all the corners and consider all the angles. But also at the end of the day, it's our clients who have the right to decide what they're going to do, if they want to do it, what pace, how, and when.
Totally.
So I kind of use the metaphor sometimes as like the counselor can be like a consultant or a coach. We're sort of on the sidelines, maybe giving feedback, encouragement, helping kind of fine tune things. But the client is the player on the field.
Yeah, that
kind
makes
of
sense.
getting out there and trying different things.
Ooh,
and
I really like that analogy. Yeah.
And so, they're also the ones who are, receiving the feedback and thinking about how to like take it in and put it into practice. And, but yeah, I do see it as kind of a team effort.
Yeah. Okay. So how can you as a counselor help the clients you're working with who are feeling stuck or unsure about their goals?
It's so easy to get stuck.
Yeah.
And I think in fact, that's often what brings people into counseling is that they're feeling stuck in some way with their goals and they aren't sure how to get going or get unstuck. So I think, it's important that we just spend some time getting curious about what's getting a person stuck and asking good questions about the goals, like coming back to how important or meaningful are those goals actually to the person. Sometimes we ask, are they setting the goal for somebody else or for themselves?
Oh, yeah. I bet that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's neat. We need to reflect on that and how that might be affecting their motivation for it.
Yeah.
And then just looking at the why. Like, why is it something that they want to change or something that they want to work on? But I think sometimes there can just be like legitimate barriers for working on a goal. And sometimes we just have to do some like problem solving. So I kind of have the example of, let's say there's a mom and she has a goal of like wanting to practice piano because that's something that's been part of her identity and she really loves and makes her feel alive, but she rarely has childcare. Or she rarely has the house to herself. So there needs to be sometimes some like problem solving around the barrier.
Yeah.
Some other work that's needed before she can take action on the thing that she most wants to do. And sometimes I think it's just good to think about in a realistic and practical way, is now the right time to pursue this goal?
Yeah.
Because, or to pursue a change in some way. So for instance, like if somebody's facing a health crisis, it may not be the best time to think about a career change or pursuing dreams of travel or something.
Sure. Yeah.
So sometimes we work with people on figuring out just some of those like practical, logistical kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the system of setting goals where they're SMART, like specific and measurable and attainable, I think it is. Realistic, timely. There we go.
Wow. Good job.
Yeah. And I mean, it's easy to kind of throw out a goal that's big, like that, something huge that you want, or something that is not that specific. Like I want to be happier. So how do you work with people to kind of make sure their goals are realistic and still challenging enough to help them grow?
Right. Yeah, I often think it's important with whatever we're doing in therapy or just in life in general, if we're working towards a change or a goal, got to consider like how can we best set ourselves up for success? How do we design a plan for change that keeps that forward momentum, keeps us engaged, keeps us committed? And I think there's ways that we can do that and be strategic about it. So sometimes that's figuring out the right pacing and making changes, making changes, taking on new challenges. But one of my colleagues was recently talking about the idea of like setting up small wins.
Yeah.
Like being strategic and getting going with something to get some traction. But it really can also then kind of contribute to a sense of confidence and pride, which then kind of helps with that momentum. You want to keep going. If you've had some small wins, it feels good. And sometimes too, like when we're working with fears and phobias, for instance, we'll use like something called exposure therapy, and we might use a fear ladder, which essentially means beginning to approach and confront our fears, but in like a phased way that the client has control over. So it's step by step. We start with something challenging, but something the person feels is doable and manageable, and they tackle that.
Okay.
And then once they kind of get going with that, then they can move on to the next step that's a little bit harder.
Yeah, if you see that you can handle that one thing, then does it give you confidence to handle the next challenging thing?
Yeah, that's the idea, is it builds confidence, it builds that sense of competence, and then you're learning all along the way, and you're building off each kind of level of learning to kind of help you get there. And we're always just sort of striving for something that's just beyond what we currently can do.
Now, those small wins, are those satisfying enough to get someone to move forward? I could see I practice it with myself, but I can kind of picture that it might not be enough, if that makes sense. Like, all I did was get out of bed today. That doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. Like, if it's someone who has, like, depression, for example.
Right.
So, how do you frame that with someone to get them to celebrate, like, the things that are hard?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I do, yeah. Because I think sometimes it'd be easy to kind of like cheapen it for ourselves.
Yeah,
like,
just
big deal.
it.
Yeah. And so sometimes that's something we can work on in counseling together, like looking at what your self-talk is around your goals.
That's true. Yeah.
But I think also, again, when it comes back to less about the ultimate destination and more about a direction, if it comes back to a position of values, what it says about you, what it says about your character, your strengths, how you want to show up in the world, even just getting out of bed, you can see how that's aligned with a value system that you can feel good about. So maybe it's not, the most dramatic thing or anything, but we can kind of reflect on, what? Maybe it was just a small thing, but it was aligned with the person that I want to be in the direction that I'm going. So I can hang my hat on that today.
Yeah.
And
I can see how hearing somebody else kind of say back to you your accomplishments, that it would just resonate differently. Like, I know I can be really hard on myself when it comes to work, but if I hear somebody else kind of say back to me the things I've accomplished, it's like, oh, actually, hearing it in that way, that makes...
It's like, oh, well, when you say it like that.
Yeah, it seems, better than you make it out to be in your head.
Totally. I think that's a good point. Like, we so rarely make meaningful changes or work on goals in a vacuum. Like, we do it with others bearing witness, with others supporting us, with people in our corner, like cheering us on or giving us tips and feedback. It's done in a social environment that I think we can leverage that to kind of support the movement.
How can, that made me think, like, how can people use, the idea of accountability and a support system to kind of help their goals, outside of the counseling room?
Yeah, there's a thing called public accountability. So you're more likely to follow through on something if you tell somebody that you're going to do it.
Yeah.
So if you just keep it silent, you don't tell anyone, you're going to be more likely to let yourself off the hook and be like, I just won't bother. But if you tell someone, no, I'm going to do this thing, and even if you ask me about it on the weekend or whatever, you're just more likely to follow through on it. So I think sometimes when we know this about kind of human psychology, we can use that to our benefit. And again, I see that as like a way that we can set ourselves up for success by doing things like that intentionally, that will just promote the likelihood that we'll follow through.
Yeah, anything that you can do for yourself to make it easier to accomplish your goals, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
This concept of values has come up a lot in this conversation, and I don't know, this always interests me because, I don't know, I just find it hard to wrap my head around, like, how do you identify what your values are. Like there are things that, that like ways that I like to behave or ways that I like to be treated or things that I, think are good. But how do I know if that's a value and if it's a meaningful value?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that could be a whole other conversation, but
yeah.
let's get the cold notes here.
No, but it's true. I think sometimes when we just throw out that word and don't clarify what we mean, it can be a little bit confusing, because a value is more of a directional thing rather than a destination, and it's different than a goal. So I'll give an example of if I have a value in having a creative life. Okay. Like I value creativity in life because it says something about the human imagination and human potential and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a broader philosophical kind of thing, but it's different than a goal. If I wanted to set a goal that's in line with that value, my goal might be I'm going to practice piano at least 3 times a week.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's to differentiate kind of the action as opposed to a characteristic, a character trait, a belief system, a philosophical kind of outlook on life mm-hmm. and the meaning of life and what's important. To me, values are it's really what it comes down to. Because if our goals aren't connected to our values in life, or what's just personally meaningful to us about what makes for a good life, then we're just probably not going to get that far on the goal, or it's not going to feel that satisfying to accomplish.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And I used that word compass before. I think values end up being a compass and sort of guiding us in uncharted territory, in rough waters, and they guide us to do something difficult in spite of the anxiety, in spite of the barriers that are there.
Right. There's a reason behind it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Values give a reason to the goal. They make the goal worth doing. Even if it's not a guaranteed success, you can still feel good about doing it if it's values driven.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have some good questions that sometimes we ask people that kind of can help clarify this sort of idea.
What are they?
Okay. And, we can talk about it in terms of value system, but, like, I just think about it in terms of, like, what are your beliefs about what makes for a good life?
Yeah, I think that makes it a lot more understandable. Like, everyone, I think, has thoughts on that,
Yeah, most people are thinking about, like, what does a good quality of life look like, or, life satisfaction, which is different than just being happy, right? It's, like, about, like, what does it mean to feel satisfied with what we're doing with our time. So sometimes I'll ask people, in 5 years, what do you want to look back on and feel proud that you committed and contributed to something in some way? In 5 years, what would you regret not having done? So sometimes these questions kind of clarify, like, this idea of, like, life priorities. What's important? Here's another one. When you think about the big picture of your life, what do you want to say you stood for? What do you want to be known for in terms of what your life was all about or what mattered to you? And then the last one, when you die, I know it's a bit morbid, but when you die, what would you want others to write on your tombstone or write in an obituary about you?
That's funny. I was on a previous episode recently, we kind of talked about the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it just gets you to kind of look back, like, how do you want to show up? How do you want to live your life?
Yeah, there's sort of, it ends up being sort of like these existential questions about what do I want to do with my time here?
Yeah. It's got me very reflective. Yeah. Carmen, how can goals kind of evolve during the counseling process?
Yeah, they do. They can change. And they do evolve because it's just natural sometimes that in the midst of therapy, life changes. Our priorities can shift, and all of a sudden, our focus is on something else that just feels more important. That's natural. That's life sometimes. But I think it's also just good to keep an eye on whether or not we're changing our goals kind of frequently.
Okay.
Because if we, sometimes it happens, if we lose traction or don't get a sense of progress on a goal, it can be really easy just to, like, avoid it, minimize why it was important in the first place, or just, like, forget about it altogether.
Right.
So if we want to change focus on goals in counseling, sometimes it's good to just explore the reason or the timing of the change. talk a little bit about like the kind of the costs or benefits of putting aside the original goal in favor of a new one. So sometimes we end up doing kind of like a goal overhaul, just depending on the person's life and what they're, what's happening or what they're working on. And other times there's just like some adjustments we make with the original goal to try to find ways together, again, in a collaborative way. How can we try to make this more realistic for you, more doable, sometimes making it more pleasurable or meaningful. And actually, I thought of you, Catherine. Because you ran a half marathon a little while, or maybe you've done more than one, right?
Yeah, I've run two.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I was thinking about you because I remember in the last one, like obviously you had this goal that you said, okay, I'm going to train for this. It's really hard to do to train for a half marathon. But then in the last one, you also did some fundraising for a family.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So I think about it as like, so you had like this great goal in the first place, and I'm sure you had your own reasons and values of wanting to do it. But also sometimes when we add in this element of like, is there a way that I can also make it more meaningful to me and to other people? Yeah. It helps with the motivation to really do it. It probably helped you like when I'm going out for my training run, I'm thinking of this family. So I think sometimes when we make these little additions or
kind
adjustments,
of branches off of a goal tree.
Yes, exactly. And then it's like, okay, you're being congruent in more than one way with the ways that you want to show up in your life.
Yeah, that's true, because it's like we have more than one value. So how can we merge our goals together? Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
And like talking about that, I can see how if someone isn't sensing progress with their goal, they might want to switch it up or, give up altogether. So how is progress kind of tracked during counseling?
Yeah, it can be really demoralizing and frustrating for people when when that happens. And sometimes we just end up feeling really down. We sometimes have the urge to give up on the goal or like distract away from it. We end up being pretty hard on ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that's often a point where people come into counseling because that might be happening. But I think it's also just good to keep in mind that slips and relapses can sometimes be part of the process when people are working on making really big changes in their life. And so we don't want to, we want to help people not beat themselves up about that, but to work with it.
I think we really need to go easy on ourselves, especially if it's like, I don't know, any change really, any behavior change. It's like going to be perfect at every step.
Yeah, no, but it's true, right? Because if we have a slip or we're not getting there as fast as we would have thought, we would have hoped we would have.
Yeah.
If we end up being really tough on ourselves, it can be very demoralizing and justifying for just giving up on it. But I think, to kind of normalize it, just to say, yeah, this is expected. It's hard.
Totally. Yeah, we need to expect that of ourselves. Like, it's not always going to be an easy path.
No. Yeah. And it's not, that's true for everybody when they're working on something hard. So just to kind of normalize it and then to look at, is there a way that we can kind of get curious about it and maybe a way to learn from it? So if I had a slip in my goal, just taking a good look, non-judgmentally, but with curiosity to say, okay, what factors maybe contributed to that? And importantly, okay, for next time, how can I plan to cope ahead with those kinds of challenges in the future? Or how can I better plan for expected or unexpected challenges that arise during those process of change?
Yeah.
Or, thinking about, okay, for next time, what other supports or resources are going to help bolster me up and get me back on track? Who are the people in my corner and how can I bring them in right now? Because this is a tough moment. I think there's lots of ways that we can work with like the tough moments to actually make it stronger.
Yeah, this reminds me of my stepson. And when he was younger, he he was really creative and really into drawing and art and things like that. And he'd watch a lot of YouTube videos, which was great on one hand. Like he's, learning from these people, but he would get frustrated if what he was doing didn't turn out like theirs. And I don't know, that's what kind of bugs me about social media and stuff, because they only show you the end result. And I would try to relate to him, like, you're not seeing the hours and hours of practice.
That's
and the mistakes and the progress along the way. You're just seeing this one portion.
That's right.
Yeah.
He's seeing the destination
Yeah.
that he's not at yet.
Yeah.
And that can be really demoralizing. Like when it's like that whole thing, it's unfair to compare, it's not, it can really demotivate people, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. If they're kind of using it in the wrong way.
I like that. Just normalizing and acknowledging, like, it's not always going to be smooth sailing, but it doesn't mean you're not moving in the right direction.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And even to expect that it's going to be hard. Expect that there's going to be times you want to give up.
Yeah.
The more that we can kind of be real about that, the more we can make a plan for how we want to keep acting in line with our valued direction.
Totally. Yeah. Like, I don't know. I've said on this podcast before, like, so much about, like, through my running journey, I've learned so much about, like, my mental health and myself. And that was one of the things I'd learned along the way, is, like, to expect hard runs. It's not like every run I do is going to be better than the last. Like, definitely not. So now going into a new training season, it's like I'm going to expect that there are going to be days where this run just feels awful.
Totally. Yeah. And just to kind of accept that you'll still go out the next day or the next few days or whatever, but there's just going to be, it's part of the process.
For sure.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, we've got to be kind of flexible in setting these goals, and especially if we're saying it's not a concrete destination, that it is more of a direction. So how do you encourage flexibility? How do people working towards goals kind of practice flexibility?
Yeah. I think pretty much all of the time, flexibility trumps rigidity.
Yeah.
It's better to be flexible. We can be less stressed about it. We can look at more options for different ways to go about something. We can be a little bit more open to ideas. And I think it just matters less about the destination that we want to get to, but that direction. And I think when we kind of keep that in mind, there's just many ways that we can be flexible and still changing while still staying true to the overall direction we'd like to be going in.
Yeah.
But I think your question of, like, how do we be flexible? Because it's sometimes easier said than done. I think sometimes we don't realize how rigid our expectations might be or how much pressure we're putting on ourselves about it. So I think talking about it with other people can be really helpful to kind of get some different perspectives, different ideas about, like, different ways to go about a goal, or just kind of getting feedback on how well you're doing. Because sometimes people do these things and they aren't getting that support and they feel like it's never enough. But other people are like, oh my God, you've done so much. You're amazing. So just like not cutting that part of it off.
Yeah.
But I think a big part of it is like that self-talk and like relationship with ourself, like if we have really rigid beliefs of, unless I do this, it means I'm going to be a failure or something, that can really trip people up. And that's definitely something we work on in counseling to see if we can adjust some of those rules that we set for ourselves, and these really firm expectations that we think that they should be motivating us, but they end up being kind of more demoralizing or putting this unnecessary pressure that ends up being kind of counteractive.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up another thing about running, and you let me know if it kind of applies, because it made me think of it. So, like, for example, when I'm training for a half marathon, I do have, a rough time goal. Like, I'd want to complete it in a certain amount of time. But then I also have, like, these side, like, sub goals. It's like, okay, maybe I don't finish in that time, but, at least, want to finish without walking during the run. Like I want to run straight through, or like, do you know what I mean? Like, do you work with clients and set kind of multiple goals around the same thing? Is it that explicit? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. I think about, I haven't run as much as you have. I've done a little bit, but yeah, like, so for some people, part of their options for being flexible and how they might complete a long run includes like a walk-run program, and then other people it's just run. Some people use like the watch, and other people don't.
Yeah, I know. I just said the run all the way through, but I've never done it. I don't think
right.
But
I think it's just so good to be, go into it thinking like, yeah, I might adjust my time as my training program goes along. I might adjust my expectations. Sometimes people who are doing lots of training, they get injured. It's like, okay, now I'm dealing with a strained hamstring or something. How do I need to adjust my my approach, or like
that's
my
where the
time.
Flexibility comes in.
Yeah, and then if you don't do that, then you just feel. It would just feel awful, because it's like, well, it's an all or nothing thinking, right? And that's where people sometimes get into trouble, where it just feels like a failure or something.
And I think, like the same kind of mindset can be applied to life. Like you can have this goal and direction, but like you said, life happens around you, and unexpected things can happen. So you kind of got to work with. Yeah.
I actually love thinking about people running these long races, because you think about like all of the different reasons, rationales, desires, values that are happening for each individual person. Everyone comes to it with like their own history. Some people have had health crisis, or some people have been really like making other kinds of life changes, and it's symbolic to them of other things that they're doing in their life. So I just feel that's so inspiring, but also I'm so touched by this is like slightly tangential, but I do feel like it's connected to goals, because you think about, say someone's on a race and somebody trips, and then you see other runners stop and help them. Right?
Yeah.
So you see these like moments of connection. They're in this together. There's this camaraderie, and there's this like connection of the human spirit. That is also part of like, so it's not just running to cross the finish line. It's something about like the human spirit being, like, how it kind of manifests on that stage of life, And then you have all the people cheering, and every time I see these people cheering, I tear up, because they're just like, people are joining in like the spirit of like doing something hard and cheering each other on. And it's like, just so neat.
Yeah. Like you see races like that, and I mean, yes, it's heartwarming to see people cheering on the sides, but you don't really understand how much that means until you run. Like that makes all the difference in the world. I remember my first first half marathon. My brother, he came like along the route and cheered me on at one point, and it gave me such a boost. Like honestly, it was like a hit of caffeine or something. Just seeing someone you care about cheering you on. Like
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a good thing for this conversation about goals as well, is like, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just about your inner life. It's about you being in the world with your friends, with your family, and your community. I think when we involve others, it becomes all the more meaningful when we're like working on it.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much for this conversation, Carmen.
Thank you so much. I think to me, it's like an exciting topic, because it's really about working with people on like what matters most to them. What makes for a good life, what are the priorities. And I think when we're having those kinds of conversations, it never feels superficial. It always feels like deeply personal and often inspiring. So thanks for thinking of this topic and inviting me to talk about it with you.
Thank you. You've been listening to Living Fully, a Calgary Counseling Center podcast. Thank you for tuning in. This episode was produced by Nick Here, Louisa Campos, Manuel Montano, Jenna Forbes, and by me, Catherine Hertig. A special thanks to Carmen Sadoway. To stay up to date on our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe. We're available in your favorite podcast app. Living Fully is a production of Calgary Counseling Center and recorded in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Living Fully podcast is not a substitute or alternative for professional care or treatment. Calgary Counselling Centre and Counselling Alberta provide effective counselling to anyone in Alberta with no waitlist and no financial barriers. Find us online at calgarycounselling.com and counsellingalberta.com. For help across Canada and the United States, call 211. If you are outside of Canada and the US, seek help from your general medical practitioner.